All right, it's showtime. Welcome to the Grayzone. We are here with Moscow-based international analyst Mark Sleboda to discuss one of the most momentous and disturbing events of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, which is the targeting of political philosopher Alexander Dugin, the assassination of his daughter on the way back from a festival. And it appears that the assassination, at least according to Russia's FSB, Internal Security Service, the perpetrator is the Ukrainian SBU, which is Ukraine's CIA-trained intelligence and security service. So I think I should just let you weigh in here before we get into the politics of Dugin, the concept of Duginism, and why he was targeted, and just your initial thoughts on the importance of what just took place, in which a state apparently targeted a civilian and used one of its operatives to do so, and whether Russia's FSB is indeed correct that the Ukrainian SBU is responsible for this political assassination.
Yeah. Okay. Max, thanks for having me. It's actually a real honor and a pleasure to be on the Grayzone. I'm a big fan.
Thank you for joining. I think you have a lot to offer here on this topic. So,
yeah. So first off, let me full disclosure, inside view, maybe, I was a colleague of Alexander Dugin. I taught in the sociology faculty at Moscow State University several years ago, where he was also teaching. And we knew each other. We worked together. I met his daughter, Daria. We became friends. I consider both of them friends. So it is, a bit of a personal blow to me as well, to see Daria snuffed out like that, 29 years old. She had just finished her equivalent of PhD in philosophy. She was, budding in several fields, philosophy, political activist, journalist. She did a lot. She died young, but she burned bright, I guess would be something to say. She and her father appear to have both been targeted. And the reasons why they were targeted is at least partially because they supported the Russian intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict. But of course, the history goes back much further than that. Now, certainly with regards to her father, in the West, there is a sea of disinformation and propaganda about Alexander Dugin that has at the same time created a caricature image of him, some type of evil Rasputin type image, and at the same time blown him, his importance, his influence completely out of proportion. And the reason for that is the creation of some type of bogeyman, and then the use of that to tar the Russian president. And with all due respect to Alexander Dugin, to Alexander Gaylovich, he is a very marginal figure in Russian politics and society, right? I mean, when he started up a political party a few years ago, I mean, it barely registers at 0.2%. Right? He's no huge influence on Russian society. He has, his diehard, supporters, Eurasianists, but it is not by any means a mainstream political ideology or movement. Alexander Dugin and his daughter, they never met and have never spoken to Putin, despite the presentation of him as Putin's brain, or the ideologue behind Putin's foreign policy, or the architect of the Russian intervention in Ukraine. Yeah, none of that is true in the slightest. They've never met, they've never spoken. Putin has never once mentioned any of his unique ideas as a political philosopher. And he has never even mentioned his name or his daughter's name up until 2 days ago when she was murdered in a terrorist attack. He in no way informed or influenced Putin or policy in the Kremlin in the slightest. In fact, when 2014, 2015, when the civil conflict there first broke out after the government was overthrown in the US-backed Maidan Putsch, and then the people of Donbass started to rise up to say, we don't accept this, first peacefully, and then, of course, it became violent when the Kiev regime sent first the military in, and then the battalion, the neo-Nazi battalions, because the military was essentially non-functional and non-responding to the newly established Maidan regime in Kiev at that time. After the initial bout of conflict, and particularly the massacre of trade unionists, the anti-Maidan activists in Odessa, the Odessa massacre, Alexander Dugin became very stridently demanding a Russian military intervention at that time. But the Kremlin was going a completely different way, and they tried to settle things into a frozen conflict to provide a level of support to the people of Donbass, but never enough that they could expand, right, and threaten the regime in Kiev as it attempted to rebuild its military and gain control. Instead, they pushed for a political reconciliation in the form of the Minsk Accords, which Professor Dugin thought was naive, was a type of appeasement. So the Kremlin pushed to get Dugin removed from his teaching position at Moscow State University. And then he was also essentially informally banned from state media, from mainstream media in Russia, and from the political talk show circuit that he had been kind of a stalwart as a, you know, an educated academic, but also a bit of an agent provocateur. He was gone from that. And after that, for years, the only channel that he appeared on was the private channel of an extremely orthodox Russian oligarch, the channel called Tsargrad. So that obviously doesn't mesh up with the idea that he's Putin's Rasputin or he's Putin's brain or anything like that.
Yeah, I think it's important to offer our audience a sampling of some of the media that portrayed him as Putin's Rasputin. We had a 60 Minutes, Leslie Stahl did a segment on him, but I think the most indicative report was by Glenn Beck. This really captures how the U.S. media portrayed Dugin. And in that respect, Beck was kind of ahead of the curve because this was in 2015, and he did another segment on February 23rd of this year, the date of the invasion, basically holding Dugin responsible for the entire thing. But here's what you need to know about Russian leader Alexander Dugin on the Glenn Beck program.
Alexander Dugin, a prominent philosopher, a professor, and he's known to be an advisor to some of the most influential men in Russia. The Russian foreign minister, the second chairman of the state, the United Russia Party chief ideologist, and of course, President Vladimir Putin, not only advising the Kremlin, But in 2008, Dugin became the head of the Department of Sociology of International Relations at Moscow State University.
That's true.
Pushing his ideology to Moscow's intellectual elite and young minds ever since. This is one of the most dangerous human beings on the planet today, Dugin. His philosophical doctrine uses a combination of geopolitics, political theory, and philosophy to incite Russian nationalism. Plainly stated, it's Russian national fascism. Dugin believes what Russia needs is, quote, a genuine, true, radically revolutionary, and consistent fascist fascism. Duginites see Eurasia in a time tunnel as part of a greater Russian empire, land dominated by a superior culture and civilization. Quote, everything will fall into place if we recognize Russia as a civilization, not just a country. In other words, Russia cannot be compared with other countries such as Switzerland, France, Germany, Belgium, England, Italy, and Spain. Russia should be compared with Europe as a whole, or with the Islamic world, or with the Chinese civilization.
So there you have Glenn Beck distilling, and he's basing that off of like stuff he read in the Daily Beast. Mark, you know Andrew Karibko. He is a pundit and blogger, commentator based in Russia, who is a Eurasianist. He wrote the following: Darya's assassination, Darya referring to Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin. Darya's assassination represents a crossing of the Rubicon in the Ukrainian conflict, whereby Kiev has escalated its terrorist attacks to the point of targeting the family members of civilians who they were duped by fake news into falsely thinking are unofficially very influential policymakers, like they seem to have believed her father is. The fact that she was killed despite their presumably intended target unexpectedly deciding to go home in a different vehicle suggests that the perpetrators still decided to go through with their plot in order to, at the very least, send a message to him and Moscow more broadly that they've decided to escalate their US-backed hybrid war on Moscow. And just one more quick thing. Well, I actually need to pull this up from our notes, but right before the assassination, it wasn't Glenn Beck, but actually Ukrainian national TV that aired a special on Dugin essentially being Putin's brain. He controls Putin, stated this special. Yeah, they called him Putin's brain explicitly and described him as the ideologue of the Russian civilization. This is 1+1, which is a major channel in Ukraine. And here's their special, which is chalked up since April 19th, since it aired, close to 500,000 views. So, Mark, what do you make of all that? What do you make of the presentation of Dugin? Were the quotes that Glenn Beck presented accurate? And to what extent did these factor into his assassination?
Okay, so that one particular quote that sticks out there, the fascist revolution, that was a young Alexander Dugin writing in the 1980s when he was undergoing there was all kinds of crazy political thought going on in Russia at the time, and people were exploring lots of radical things. And for a time, he fell into that. And that's at one point, I was a U.S. liberal Democrat and worked for the election of John Kerry, right? That's not something I'm proud of, right? But people undergo political evolutions, and that has nothing to do with his current political philosophy and the ideology that he settled into several years after that youthful radical phase. So he disavowed all of that publicly many times. I translated one of his books, The Fourth Political Theory, into English. If you really want to know, what it is about Dugin and his philosophy, he is anti-Atlanticist, right? He's against U.S. hegemony. He's pro-multipolar world. His book, The Fourth Political Theory, was basically, that was the culmination of his political theory. And he said, the big political ideologies of the 20th century, liberal democracy, communism, and fascism have all failed. They've all failed. So let's look at each one of them, sort through the debris, and that there's anything useful in the three of them that can be used to construct a new politics for the 21st century. And he specifically in that decried, how, the racial hatred and the violence and so forth of fascism were, of course, completely unacceptable and inappropriate to a political ideology. So don't trust what Glenn Beck says. Don't pick cherry-picked quotes, from 4 decades ago. Read him for yourself, something that he has written in the last 10 or 15 years, please. But regardless of that, it has, if we're at the point of assassinating academics and civilians based on their political ideology or their political opinion, we're moving into an extremely dangerous world. And I do believe that Karibko has a good point there, in that I find that one of the principal culprits in this is the Western mainstream media. They are fully culpable in this because they have both created this caricature image and blown him up out of all proportion. And I believe that, the Kiev intelligence services and those that they may have worked with to commit the terrorist attack, they knew this, of course. They know that he's not an important figure, right? But the reality is not important anymore because we're living in a postmodern information, disinformation world where the meme has become the reality. And it is not important, the reality of how important he is, but in the perception of people's minds, both in the propaganda of the Kiev regime and in the mainstream Western media, it's there where his removal, right, his assassination would be seen as a victory. And let's face it, the Kiev regime right now needs victories. It is incapable of them on the battlefield. It is incapable of any much ballyhooed counteroffensive. It is bleeding casualties at a truly, really brutal and awful rate.
Yeah.
It has no military. It's not capable of any military. So it resorts to sabotage, nuclear terrorism, with the strikes on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and now this assassination. Because, whoa, the propaganda victory at home, the signal that we're still strong and in control of the country, if we wipe out the person that we say was the ideologue behind the intervention, the invasion of our country. Not true at all, but the truth doesn't matter. And that is why. I think we've learned a little bit since Karibko's statements, though. It was not, it's pretty clear now that it was not Dugin who was targeted and Daria got in the way. We know specifically now that they targeted both of them and that she might have actually been the primary target. And you say, why? I mean,
why?
Yeah, why? That is not entirely clear at this point. Evidently, I mean, we know that the person who either killed her or was involved in the assassination, this Ukrainian SBU agent, Natalia Vovk, the Russian FSB has provided images of her entering the country, changing her hair color, her license plates. She entered the country in July. She brought her 12-year-old daughter with her as cover. I mean, What kind of mother?
We're seeing footage taken by the Russian FSB right now of Natalia Vovk, who is said to be the assassin of Alexander Dugin's daughter, Darya Dugina.
Yeah. She brought her own child daughter with her as cover. I mean, what kind of mother uses their daughter, risks their own daughter as cover to kill someone else's daughter? That is really unfathomable until you find out that Natalia Vovk was a member of the Azov neo-Nazi death squad that is armed and funded and promoted and teaching in schools in Ukraine. They're brown shirts. And then, things start to fall in place. Evidently, Azov blames Daria Dugin specifically. They have a certain hatred for her because of her humanitarian work in the Donbass and her presence. She went to Azov stall and spoke there, and she said specifically that the war crimes that Azov committed in Azovstal against the people of Mariupol are something that that makes the Azovs subhuman, and that they need to be sent to war crimes tribunals. So they particularly had a serious beef with her. And when this woman, Natalia Vovk, came, she actually rented out an apartment in the same apartment building that Daria Dugina lived in to surveil her, right? So it seems that she was a particular focus of the surveillance. And again, we don't know yet whether she did this alone, whether she was the one who planted the bomb underneath the car that Daria was driving, or if someone else was involved. Did she press the remote detonation? We don't know those things, but we know that she was intimately involved in this, and that seems fairly indisputable at this point. She fled the country immediately afterwards, again changing her license plate and hair color, first onto Estonia, and she's recently been reported in Austria, renting out a hotel for a night. She's probably already moved on by now.
So, just to cut in here, if I had committed or was accused of a crime of that level, attempting to assassinate a internationally known academic, winding up killing his daughter as a political activist in a European country, and then I took off across several borders, I probably would have been nabbed. I mean, I got nabbed just for walking on a train in Munich without, they have an honor system for getting on the trains, and like 10 police guards just showed up and walked me to the closest ATM. So what's going on here? We know the Ukrainian SBU is trained substantially by the CIA. Was this Ukraine's US and UK partners upping the ante, or was Ukraine capable of executing this entirely by itself, while this alleged perpetrator, was able to just kind of surreptitiously sneak across borders without any Interpol interference?
Okay, first, Alexander Dugin was on the sanctions lists in the West, and his daughter Daria was even sanctioned by the British government, particularly a 30-year-old girl. At the time she was even a student. So it's really hard to understand the rationale, again, other than the meme has become the reality with that. But the fact that they were both sanctioned by the West, they were both also listed on the Mirotvorets hit list of the Kiev regime. The translation of that is the peacemaker. And this was a list assembled by the neo-Nazis, the Banderite fascists in Ukraine post 2014.
Here's Roger Waters on the list alongside Dugin and many others. And, I don't know if I can zoom in here, but if you look closely in the upper right-hand corner, you see Langley, Virginia, USA. I don't know what that's about.
Yeah, that is where they claim to have representative offices. So yeah, this list is up. It is essentially a hit list of basically anyone who has ever said anything critical of the regime, seen as an enemy of the state, enemy of the Kiev regime. Mostly journalists on the list, but a lot of public figures, celebrities as well. Not just in Ukraine, Russia, but the whole world over. Such luminaries as Henry Kissinger, the preeminent realist IR scholar in the US, John Mearsheimer is on the list. Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder is on there. Roger Waters. So it's quite a list. And they publish their names, their public information, right? Their addresses, they're doxing them, right? And their crimes against the Kiev regime. And this is intended as and it's, publicized even as a hit list. And this is something, it's known. The website is out there. It is claimed by Kiev that it has assisted them with over 1,000 arrests of traitors within Ukraine. At least two, a prominent Ukrainian journalist who was critical, Oleg Buzina, and also a former Ukrainian Rada member before the putsch were assassinated, and they were both on this list. And Daria makes another one now. So it is a very serious thing. There have been some muted criticism of the West coming from the standard Western humanitarian rights organizations, and some things, you should shut that down. But it's not. And it is also known, and it's even in the Wikipedia entry, that it is curated by the Ukrainian intelligence services. It was promoted by the Interior Ministry under Avakov, and it's still out there. How this can be allowed to exist, you ask that, and you can also ask why this woman hasn't been apprehended as she moves through Europe. We know that the Ukrainian military is, completely funded, armed, targeted intelligence directed by the U.S. military at this point. They have pads, mobile battle pads that they put information in, and they're provided real-time satellite information and directed on where to hit something and how to hit it, right? They're just complete proxies at this point. And we also know from the Washington Post that the HIMARS, the multiple launch rocket systems that are much exaggerated, sent by the U.S., that the Kiev regime is not allowed to target anything with them without a green light from
right.
the Pentagon.
And how are they trained so quickly to use these? I mean, we have to assume there's American assistance in the field.
That is entirely probable. The same line of reporting from the Washington Post also revealed that there are CIA and European Special Forces commandos in large numbers in the Ukraine. They go on to say that they're not directly involved, but we've seen that slippery slope of trainers and advisors in Vietnam and before. Americans are well versed in that slippery slope. So it seems unlikely. Now, there are only some 16 systems, and probably only half of them have not been destroyed at this point. Is the West possibly? We don't know, for example. We also know that the CIA has had an office in Kiev, and that according to Western media reports, mainstream media, that they were essentially running the SBU. So I find it pretty far-fetched, considering that level of control of Kiev's military and intelligence services, that they did not at least give a green light to this. And
so a green light several days after international outrage over an attack on author Salman Rushdie. Yeah. We saw a green light for the assassination of a professor who is a private citizen for things they've said in public.
Yes.
A green light by the Western patrons of Ukraine, which claims to be fighting for democracy, for the
liberal
political
democracy.
assassination of a private academic for his speech.
And the daughter.
And the daughter and their
And the
children.
daughter. Yeah.
And we've also heard calls by Ukrainian officials for killing the children and family members of Russian participants in the war.
Yes. And we recently heard the Kiev regime's ambassador to Kazakhstan said, we need to kill as many Russians now as we can so that our children don't need to kill them. And he did not use, there are two words in Russian and Ukrainian in the Slavic roots for Russian. He did not use the word for a Russian as a Russian citizen. He used the word for Russian as ethnic Russian. And of course, there are 20% of the Ukrainian population are ethnic Russians, and a good deal of the rest of the population of East Ukraine are so mixed between the two that it's pretty much impossible to make a distinction. Whether that's their language speaking, their ethnicity, their worldview, their marriages, and so on. So I find it far-fetched to think that, considering the muted late condemnations out of the US and the rest of the EU, their refusal to acknowledge that this woman is even moving through their countries. In Estonia, it seems very likely that she will probably be whisked away by the CIA or MI6 and, either enter some type of hidden protective custody or maybe something worse.
Playing beer pong with Yulia Skripal somewhere.
Yes, very much. I doubt that we will ever see her again.
Estonia, just address the significance of escaping to Estonia. Estonia is the frontline bastion of Western intelligence on Russia's frontier. Yeah.
Now, a couple of things that I'd like to say. First of all, this represents a major failure of the Russian intelligence services and their border security. This woman was identified by Russian OSINT, right? With some leaked hacking months ago as a member of Azov and the SBU. This was known. And she used her old husband's name on, we can presume, faith documents to enter with the tide of refugees that are leaving East Ukraine through the Donbass into Russia. But you would assume that there's still some type of facial recognition going on there. Obviously not, because or for whatever reason she wasn't, it wasn't updated to include her. I don't know, but there was a failure there. Also, we don't know where she got the explosives. Did she bring them with her? Did she get them here with other people that she might have been working with? Another security failure. So obviously the Russian intelligence and border really need to start up the game. They discovered all of this quickly after the fact, but only after the fact did they put the pieces together. There's another complication, and that is Ilya Ponomarev. Ilya Ponomarev is a former oppositionist in Russia. He was briefly, over a decade ago, a liberal Duma member, an MP, a congressman, if you will. And he was very much against, the Putin administration, the Medvedev administration at the time. And when he lost re-election, he essentially fled the country and was linked quite securely with the CIA. He has done the think tank circuit in DC. You can still see the slideshows online, doing slideshows to every neocon think tank in DC on how best to enact regime change in Russia. So he ended up in Ukraine, and he's actually part of the Ukrainian military forces now. He came out on Ukrainian state, it's all state TV in Ukraine now. They've enacted a unified energy policy and banned all critical media and just taken control of everything because liberal democracy, right? Just like they've banned all 15 critical opposition parties because liberal democracy, that's what liberal democracies are, completely cutting out the views of political views and media views of all of East Ukraine, essentially. He came on a show and he announced that a group that he was in contact with and financing, a guerrilla group, a terrorist group, obviously, called the National Republican Army, the NRA, who were fighting to overthrow the Russian government, and that they were responsible for the assassination. This was released about a half a day, or a little over a half a day, before the FSB came out with these videos and the identification of Natalia Volk. And he said that they were a groups he listed of far right and anarchists who were involved. And I entirely believe that. I believe that he knows 20 or 30 anarchists and Azov fanboy neo-Nazis in Russia who sign up, oh yeah, I want to overthrow the Russian government, and take some SBU money in the process. Were they involved in this? He claims they were responsible. Obviously, they were not responsible, but they very much could have been involved. Or is this just an attempt to muddy the waters? We don't know that yet.
Well, you have all these tools of the Ukrainian information war suggesting that the National Republican Army was created by the FSB as cover.
I haven't heard that one yet. And the fact that they would do it through Ilya Ponomarev makes absolutely zero sense whatsoever. But so much of it makes little sense whatsoever to begin with.
Well, yeah, I mean, here's Anton Gerashenko, who's, basically one of the front men for the Interior Ministry and SBU's hit squad mafia. He's publicly boasted about the assassination of mayors who negotiated with Russia to establish civilian humanitarian corridors. Yes, and here he is.
They were collaborators and they were assassinated. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is a guy who is inciting murder of elected officials, and he's verified by Twitter. He's in communication with lots of Western reporters, and he's promoting the manifesto of the National Republican Army in English.
Мы объявляем президента Путина узурпатором власти и военным преступником, поправшим Конституцию, развязавшим братоубийственную войну между славянскими народами и отправившим российских солдат на верную бессмысленную смерть. Нищета и гробы для одних, дворцы для других.
And they're referring to the apartment bombings, which is a popular theory about
люди имеют право
It's a lot like conspiracy theories around the Oklahoma City.
Наша цель – остановить уничтожение России и ее соседей.
Probably inspired by that.
Well, but it also, I mean, just not to get off track, but it's featured as sort of a fact, an established fact, that Putin staged a false flag attack in order to justify the entry of Russia into the second phase of the Chechenian war in BBC's documentary profile of Putin, which has millions of views on YouTube.
It's pretty interesting that they completely ignore the fact that the Chechen national Islamist leader Dudayev sent these Chechen raids to expand the Islamist slave owning state of Ichkeria into mainland Russia, attacked hospitals and also residential buildings, killed large numbers of people. That, of course, had nothing to do. We needed these apartment bombings by Putin to justify the intervention, because the raids into mainland Russia with the intent of expanding Ichkeria, weren't enough.
And this was when the CIA was running ops around Central Asia, when the Chechnyan resistance was jihadified. I mean, doesn't seem to me that there needed to be such a spectacular event to justify, at least to the Russian domestic population, what Putin wanted to do. But here you have a replication of that tactic. I mean, whoever is putting this propaganda out there, it's a psyop. It's aiming to get into the heads of the Russian leadership, because, as you said, Mark, the military situation is not looking good on the ground for the Ukrainian army. And they, at the same time, you're seeing, as a result of this psychological operation, Western press leveraging it to claim that Dugin may have even murdered his own daughter, or that the FSB was behind this operation, which seems to serve no strategic or even tactical purpose from my point of view.
Again, reality makes no difference. Logic does not, apply to these conceptions. I was on Indian TV, always a mistake, earlier today, doing an interview, and she was questioning in the intro that people mourning for her death in Moscow today, a very large public gathering, were not sincere, that it was all staged and fake.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I was one of those people. Are you seriously questioning whether I was really mourning, crying for a friend, that a 30-year-old woman that I knew? What is wrong with you? What is your problem?
I mean, yeah, it must feel outrageous from where you are.
Yeah. I mean, this has been a constant refrain that has come from the Kiev regime and been parroted, at least either reporting it as full truth or as we can't know the truth, by the Western media all along. The Kiev regime was never bombing the cities of Eastern Ukraine. It never happened. That was always those pro-Russian separatists bombing themselves to make Kiev look bad. That's what the Kiev regime was saying from day one, and what the Western mainstream media repeated completely uncritically. No matter how many OSCE reports, came back about the landing of artillery's pieces, and the big onslaught of that finally was the provocation that definitively initiated the Russian intervention back in February. It doesn't matter those OSCE reports or anything like that. It never really happened. In Odessa, when those pro-Russians were burned alive in the train union building, the anti-Maidan activists, they did it to themselves. They burned themselves alive.
Right.
All of the leaders, all of the military leaders, President Zaharchenko of the Donbass, that was all the FSB. They killed all of them, right? And we didn't do any of that. I mean, we did, but we did it. It was the Russians, with a wink and a nod, unofficially, coming out from channels and presidential advisors of Zelensky. It is also bizarrely postmodern that they can lie so absurdly. Someone with any remnant of intelligence or logical thinking, can say, oh my God, that's, so absurd. But it doesn't make any difference, because that's the way they want to sell this narrative to you. And so they do.
And then to declare us conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, right. I mean, they uncritically repeat the ghost of Kiev, right? The Snake Island martyrdom hoax, the fake bombing of Baba Yar Holocaust Memorial, the fake bombing of Chernobyl. Now the Russians are bombing themselves as the occupiers of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, just to blame us. It goes on and on again. And again, sometimes the West uncritically parrots it, and at other times they're like, who can know? And so it continues, because you cannot criticize the Kiev regime. We saw that. Amnesty International just came out with a report that detailed how systemically the Kiev regime's military forces occupy residential buildings, schools, hospitals, use them as bases, firing points, and without even evacuating the people. In many cases, using them as human shields, obviously a war crime, and then crying when Russia attacks those schools and hospitals that Russia is committing a war crime. Amnesty International came out with that report and has since been forced to backtrack on it.
Right.
Similarly,
by its Ukrainian bureau.
By its Ukrainian bureau. Similarly, there were reports in the Western media was it the Financial Times, recently detailing the reports of a NGO out of the Baltics, that Blue Yellow, that has been arming the Kiev regime with Western weapons, arranging for them to get there since 2014. And they said that 70% of the weapons were disappearing into the corruption sea of the Kiev regime before they ever reached the front line. They were forced to walk that back because the Western media is not allowed to say anything critical of the Kiev regime. And if they do, they are assaulted by statements, armies of bots and sock puppet accounts and this woke army in social media and politicians and journalists until they retract their heresy. And
yeah, we have a piece about that on the Grayzone republished from antiwar.com on how CBS retracted. But Mark, you're bringing up a really important development that I think relates to the assassination of a private citizen by the Ukrainian state, by Ukrainian intelligence, which is that the information wars have gone into a really ugly phase, and people are being targeted who are not taking the Ukrainian government's line, including, people like Martin van Creveld, a military historian whose crime was actually that he was too triumphalist at the beginning of the war, predicting an initial victory, a sweeping victory for Ukraine. And then he pulled back and said, actually, this may not happen. And he wound up on one of these kill lists along with Glenn Greenwald and other public figures. I believe John Mearsheimer is on the list. Stephen Walt tweeted something that diverged from the Kiev line 3 or 4 days ago. He was swarmed by this NAFO army, NAFO, for those who aren't familiar. And I'm also a constant target, and I always can, see developments in trolling. I'm constantly a target, many different lobbies and elements online, but this one is particularly vicious because they seek to take aim not just at me, but at family members, at anyone they can figure out who's close to me. They want to get as personal as possible. And the Ukrainian government is actually working closely with, I believe, Western intelligence to escalate the psychological warfare against critics of the war. And one example that
not just
came
critics
up
of the war, but critics of the U.S. globally, because you and a lot of the other people touch on a lot of subjects other than Ukraine.
Right.
And,
well, we have the Syria trolls, we have the pro-Israel trolls, but what I was referring to is that there's a group in London called Molfar. It's entirely consistent of Ukrainian nationalists. They've received money from USAID, the US CIA humanitarian and regime change cutout, as well as the UK Foreign Office. And they put me on their traders list. But this was really interesting because they didn't publish the list publicly. They distributed it to hundreds and hundreds of journalists. And so I had people who, I don't know how their emails were obtained, but they were people around left-wing, independent, alternative media who were telling me that they had been furnished with a dossier of me by this group Molfar, this open source intelligence group. And it was offering all of this supposed intelligence on how, Russia has sponsored me to change all my views, and that I was able to live this lavish lifestyle thanks to Kremlin support, and that it was going to contain
lavish lifestyle.
Yeah, it was, and it was going to contain information on all my associates and so on. And so, I had several friends and colleagues request this report. This is by the UK Morning Star here. It's about the report, and quotes me. It's called, they publish a book of orcs, and they've doxed children inside the independent Donetsk and Lugansk republics. Molfar has, and I responded by saying Molfar has been too cowardly to provide his dodgy dossier to my colleagues, so I've not seen it in full, but the claims made in its mass email are totally false. We don't receive state funding at the Grayzone, and unlike the USAID-backed smear factory at Molfar, our support is entirely grassroots and reader base, this half-baked attempt at intimidating me for my factual journalism pales in comparison to the repression and violence meted out by the US-backed post-Maidan regime against many Ukrainian journalists, politicians, and human rights activists who have dissented against its corrupt and authoritarian rule. So we've been talking about that, Mark, throughout this conversation, because that targeting went beyond Ukrainian borders into Russia. So it leads me to wonder if other people will begin to be targeted in this way. And I should mention that I actually did finally obtain the dossier on me. It was delivered by Molfar CMO Darya Verbitska, who has previously worked for the Ukrainian government as its coordinator on foreign affairs. And she complained that she didn't want me to be able to see it to the person she provided it to. Well, in any case, I saw it. It is what you would expect to be written by a bunch of Banderite trash who can barely form coherent sentences. It's laughable in its quality. However, it contains my personal details, or at least what they think are my personal details. It contains the details of my family members' personal details. They've doxed everyone remotely affiliated with me. And they even doxed people who employ my family members. And so at certain points in this document, editors in other media outlets, including like legacy media outlets, have their personal details revealed, their phone numbers, their home addresses. And this is what's going on inside London with the support of the US and UK governments by a Ukrainian nationalist InfoWars organization. It's pretty obvious where they're trying to take this. And let me just share one more thing. This is a tweet from Alexei Kovalev, who you know, Mark, probably from Medusa, which is US aid and UK Foreign Office and Swedish government-sponsored publication. He tweeted this about, the clock is ticking on you, to me. And, you know, not afraid of this dork. You know, for some reason, Russian liberals living abroad don't frighten me. They're like, they're basically like US shit libs, but they have like this romantic quality that's
there. Medusa's American editor, Kevin Rothrock, there was a leak of his emails with the liaison between the State Department and the CIA for Russia, whom
right.
Foreign policy outed as the principal man, behind intelligence operations in Russia. And during those emails, he offered him money and thanks for everything you do. And you're a gem, Kevin, and so forth and so on. So that's all rather amusing. Oh, everything you said is very familiar to me. I've gotten death threats myself since 2014, online, on the phone, most of them out of Toronto, most of them out of Canada.
Interesting.
There's actually, the big Banderite diaspora from Ukraine at the end of World War II, the early 1950s, when the CIA was funding and leading on the ground the Banderite insurgency. These same neo-Nazis' grandparents in the 1950s in an insurrection against the Soviet Union, they all fled to Canada and parts of the US, where that's why you can find monuments to Nazi collaborators quietly sitting all over the United States because of this very powerful Banderite Ukrainian diaspora. And the Vindmans, for example, are a big part of that, as is the former Canadian foreign minister Freeland,
right,
whose own father was involved in that. So it's no big surprise. And Dugin
involved in that he moved into stolen Jewish property in Poland and boasted about it after the war. Yeah. Then his granddaughter Freeland actually went to Russia to write a book about all the Jewish oligarchs and how they were corrupting, the Jewish communists. Anyway, she was interested in the Jews in Russia. But you were saying?
Yeah, Dugin and Daria were both receiving, evidently, multiple Ukrainian ultranationalist death threats in the days, the weeks heading up. They unfortunately didn't take it very seriously. So, I mean, there's definitely a pattern there. And, you know, that's when you really start to say, well, how far down their hit list am I?
Right. So that's the question, Mark, is, you know, when the Ayatollah in Iran issues a fatwa about an author, it's taken very seriously. I actually met Salman Rushdie on one occasion, and there were men surrounding him and at every doorway with automatic weapons, and, you know, they were talking into their sleeves. It was high level security. Are these legitimate fatwas by the Azov battalion and its Ukrainian sponsors? I mean, should they be taken seriously or just seen as empty trolling and intimidation? Because before yesterday or 2 days ago, that's how I tended to see it.
If you were in Ukraine, you would take it very seriously. Oleg Buzina, the Ukrainian journalist, critical, it was the first one. We've seen plenty of Ukrainian politicians. I, in my own very small startup YouTube channel, The Real Politique with Mark Sleboda, I've detailed a couple of videos on the Kiev regime's war on collaborators and traitors. And they have arrested thousands of people at this point, hundreds, some 600 just recently, they announced, within the SBU and the federal prosecutor's office. The governor of Nikolaev, Vitaly Kim, has revealed already several months ago that the regime has formed a death squad whose job is to go around the country and summarily execute anyone who is identified as having a collaborator, having pro-Russian sympathies. So again, this is the liberal democracy that the West is supporting, and they present this illusion of a, you know, completely unified Ukrainian nation behind their heroic Vogue photo shoot leader, former comedian. And at the same time, we know that hundreds, thousands of people are disappearing throughout Ukraine. Many of them, several officials being publicly killed and gunned down in the street. Much more, of course, to anyone just for as little as social media posts that we will never hear about. So if you're really interested in that, all you have to do is type in collaborators in Ukraine, and you will see a sea of Western reports admitting with glowing approval that hundreds and hundreds of people in every major Ukrainian city have been arrested for collaboration. And you're like, why? Why are so many people? Why are hundreds, thousands of Ukrainians collaborating in such dangerous, risky circumstances, getting caught to fight this regime? And then you have to realize that, you know, it's often presented that this is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ignoring the previous 8 years of civil conflict in the country, the regime's war to subjugate Donbass, and that there are Ukrainians on both sides of this conflict now. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting, you know, the Donbass armed forces. They have actually borne the brunt of most of the close combat fighting in Lugansk to liberate completely that area, and in Donetsk and elsewhere in the country. This is still very much a Ukrainian civil conflict, even as much as Russia has intervened now. And there are people who are fighting the regime now. They have been fighting it the last 8 years, and they are being targeted in much more horrible, heinous, brutal terms, and many of them will never hear what happened to them, as you yourself noted in your piece there.
Absolutely. And just for the record, I didn't commit suicide.
Yes, I officially declare that I will never commit suicide either. I don't think I'm so high on their list yet, but you know, they're getting desperate, so people are moving up rapidly on that list.